Simply put, this game feels like the developers plucked an RPG from the PS2 era and dropped it into the modern day. Plus, the special moves are pretty cool.
Feel the power of my magic!
Now let's chat about Battle Chasers. So Battle Chasers is a Kickstarter funded RPG based on a comic series from the 90s. I had never read the comics, and my first time with the game was back at PAX East this year. The graphics immediately caught my attention as they looked very much like Darksiders. And wouldn't you know, the same artist, Joe Mad, great name, did the artwork for both Darksiders and Battle Chasers. So I will say the story is serviceable and gives some context to the action at hand. The characters are interesting and likable, but the story isn't the most memorable. This isn't necessarily a bad thing since the game is very focused on providing exploration, combat, and progression. The story would potentially hurt the game if it was the main star, but it takes a back seat to the excellent action. I do find the world interesting along with the monsters and hero designs, and I'd love to see more from the world in sequels. As you're exploring the game, you can rest at the inn and heal your characters, and what I like is I was pleasantly surprised that each time I stayed at the inn, the game would then initiate this short skit with a conversation between characters, giving me more insight into their relationship and the world. So as an overall, this game has a very interesting world and interesting lore. The main story may not be the most compelling, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing since the combat is the true highlight here. The gameplay is made up of moving around the overworld map, exploring dungeons, and combat. You'll use the overworld maps as your means to find your next dungeon, gather resources, and interact with townspeople to then upgrade and trade. You will also encounter enemies while in the open world, and you'll see those battles coming as the game does not have any random battles. The enemies will reset after you complete a dungeon or rest at the inn. I do like that as you level up your characters, the game will give you the option to then skip enemies on the open world map because you'll be stronger than them. So they'll say, do you want to participate in a weaker battle? And you can if you want to get some resources. It's a nice feature and it helps from the game from becoming tedious. The dungeon exploring is a lot of fun in this game. Each dungeon has its own variety of enemies, items to find, secrets to discover, and puzzles to solve. Each dungeon ends in a boss fight, and I thoroughly enjoyed playing through the dungeons, and you can redo the dungeons as many times as you want. And the game actually encourages replaying the dungeons as you can play the dungeons at a higher difficulty and the dungeons are procedurally generated. So each time you complete the dungeon, the order of the rooms will change, along with some of the rooms that you will see. The first time you go through, you may not see all the variations of the different rooms that dungeon then offers, so it definitely rewards you for going back. I will say I completed most of the dungeons in the game at least 3 times, some of them about 6 or 9 times because I just found myself thoroughly enjoying the gameplay. And you'll want to explore those dungeons again because they provide you with some really good loot, and you can trade some really good items that you earned from the dungeons for more skill points. When you're not moving around the world map and dungeons, you'll be in combat. The combat is a traditional turn-based combat system. Think something like Final Fantasy X. I love the turn-based combat. The combat is fast and it can be rather intense. I really like that while you're in combat, you can complete basic attacks that will build up your overcharge meter, and as your overcharge meter is built, some of your skill attacks will then do more damage. But the trade-off is to earn the overcharge, you need to use your basic attacks to then build this up. So it's a bit of a risk and reward system. Also, overcharge will act as your mana points. So if you're out of mana, you don't have any more magic power, but you build up your overcharge, then you can then summon abilities to help out your team or then damage your opponents. And then as you keep executing your turns, then you'll build up a burst meter, which then you can execute a character-specific special move. And these are very stylish and very cool to look at. And what's nice is you have both offensive and defensive moves. Lastly, I really love the art style to this game. It's colorful and it sort of jumps out at you. And overall, the music for the game is very good, with some tracks not being what I expected in a good way, and I really like that they took some risks with the soundtrack. The main theme for when you're in the main town in the game, is excellent, and some of the battle music is really good. Now let's chat about some of the areas to improve upon. So while I enjoyed the soundtrack, as a whole I do wish that the main battle music used for many of the standard battles had more of a punch to it, and it was a bit more memorable. Your main battle theme is really important for an RPG, as this is the theme you will consistently hear the most throughout the game. And I'm not saying it has to be iconic like something from the Final Fantasy games, but I wish it had a little bit more of a punch to it. This isn't really a negative, it's just more of a glorified nitpick. As I was playing the game, I did notice that the game would stutter a bit briefly while in combat or exploring, and this was noticeable and a bit annoying, but didn't really hurt the overall experience. The biggest issue I had was crashing, and I experienced this a lot while I was playing this on the PS4. Thankfully, I've heard the PC version is a lot more stable than this, and I would advise you to play it on the PC because this is from what I've read. But the PS4 version, I mean, it crashed on me into the double digits. Now, as I was playing the game, a patch came out, and they were able to then really help this area of the game. I mean, the game released, and within like a week or so, they were able to get this patch out, and I really got to commend them on getting it out as fast as they can with that, because not only do they have to then patch the game, they have to go through the approval process with Sony to then get that patch out. So there's a lot of bureaucracy that kind of gets in the way for us as the player to be able to get those patches in a timely manner, and I felt like they did a pretty good job with it. And better yet, when I started up the patch, I noticed that the game would crash less frequently than what it was before. From what I could see, when the crashing was happening, it was tied to how long I had been playing the game. So about around the 2-hour mark, the game would crash. That was the only consistent part of it. Now, I was able to play the game for a full like 6 hours before the game would crash on me. I did have other crashes that experienced late in the game, and I think that was probably associated with the different areas. And that's really my biggest negative with the game, is just the overall performance. But what's nice is this isn't necessarily a negative within the core mechanics of the game, and this is something I think that they can really work on and get this more stable with future patches. Thankfully, the game has a very good autosaves feature, so in every instance of all those crashes, I had never lost any progress. I really only had to sit through a bunch of load screens again, which is annoying, but doesn't completely kill the experience. And I will say that is something that I wish was a bit faster, because sometimes you'd play the game and it would load up a battle and it would take a full 30 seconds. And I'm like, why? It's just a standard battle. And some areas would take a long time to load while others wouldn't. And I'd like those to get a little bit more ironed out and to be at least a little bit more consistent. But at least from what they've shown so far is they've demonstrated that they really care about their audience and that they want to keep patching and improving the game in terms of its stability on the consoles and PC. So even with the areas I mentioned that could use some improvement, I had a great experience with this game. The game has a distinct and beautiful visual style, a good soundtrack, loads of progression, and a solid combat system. On top of that, the game has a New Game Plus option, and the game took me 70 hours to complete. This game is going for $30 to $25 right now. So basically, for every buck, I got about 2 hours of gameplay. There's a lot of gameplay here, and I haven't even started New Game Plus. And better yet, when this finally comes out to the Switch, this is going to be a fantastic game for the Switch. Because the game autosaves so often, and you're able to then save your progression, you can really pick up, oh, I'll play a dungeon. You know, I have like an hour, half an hour, I'll do a dungeon, and then I'll leave the game for a bit and come back to it. So that's going to be a great game to either you play on your home console or you play on the go. Overall, I would say, even with some of the issues, Battle Chasers is totally worth checking out. I thoroughly love this game, even with some of the flaws, and I really hope that we see more from this series in the future. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.